How about we turn a swivel knife practice into a quick little piece of art? That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Reese. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we're going to be tackling a quick little swivel knife practice piece, maybe is what you could call it. I don't know about you, but when I was learning to use a swivel knife, I got tired of doing all those same strokes, the straight lines, the curves. I got tired of doing all that after a little while because one, I felt like I wasn't accomplishing anything. Two, I couldn't compare my progress to where I started. And three, I realized that I could do pretty much whatever I wanted, which means it wasn't applicable to a real project. And what I mean by that is I didn't have lines to follow. I didn't have to stop my cut at a certain point. It just pretty much, it was a free-for-all. I could do whatever I wanted. There was no precision required. So today, we're going to take all those practice strokes, turn them into a quick little art piece that anybody can do, and it'll help you up your swivel knife skills. So let's talk about the different parts of a swivel knife, how it works, what it does, all that kind of good stuff. Well, let's start at the top. I've heard this called the yoke. I've heard it called a saddle, a cradle, all kinds of different things. But bottom line is this is where your finger rests, and you want the forward half of your finger. That's the part that you're going to use. I like this pad right here in the middle of my finger. That's what I like to rest in that saddle right there. Typically, you're going to see me doing something like that, maybe even a little more forward like that. Depends on how my hand's feeling, how tired it is. But all the downward pressure on the swivel knife comes from this finger and the saddle right there. Below that, we've got the barrel, and this is the part that we're going to hold with our two middle fingers and our thumb, and essentially that's going to allow us to steer the knife. And of course, it wouldn't be much of a knife without a blade. Blades come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are angled like this one, some of them are flat, more like this one. No matter what kind of blade you have, you're always going to want it riding on that back corner. And by back corner, I mean the one that's the furthest away from you. So if it's a flat blade, you're going to have to tip it a little bit. If it's got an angle on it, you might be able to run it a little bit more flat. But essentially, we want that back corner to do all the cutting. So let's talk about a few things you want to avoid with a swivel knife. Well, the first one is going to be tipping your blade. You don't want to tip it one side or the other, especially as you go around a curve. What happens is that creates an undercut, and an undercut, it essentially allows the leather to lift, wrinkle, and peel away from the project. Now, it's not going to be as bad on something that might hang on the wall versus, say, a wallet or a belt, but still, unless you're intentionally trying to undercut the leather, and there are times you want to, unless you're intentionally trying to undercut the leather, you want to avoid that, and the way you avoid it is by keeping your blade straight up and down. So the second thing you want to avoid is rolling your wrist to create a curve. Whenever you're creating a curve, the movement should come from your arm and by turning the barrel of the swivel knife. Now, a little bit of a curve in your wrist, that's okay, that's not a big deal. But what we want to avoid is those big arcs. That's going to give you imprecise cuts, and it's going to create a higher likelihood that you'll create undercuts. The last big thing that I would really encourage you to try to avoid is pushing your swivel knife. These blades are designed to be pulled. They work best on the pull stroke. Now, there are some scenarios where you might want to push it for just a tiny little bit. Say you're finishing off a curve and you want to get that last little piece of the curve in there. You might want to do that, but in general, you want to avoid pushing your swivel knife. Now that we got the basics down, we can start the prep steps. So first, we're going to start by casing the leather. Most of the time, I'm just going to spray it with a large spray bottle. I'm looking for kind of a honey color. I want it to take about 1 to 2 seconds for that moisture to soak into the leather. After that, we're going to let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes, just until the color starts to return somewhat to normal. So with that done, we can go ahead and strop our blade. This is really simple. A quick explanation would be we want to apply some jeweler's rouge to a piece of leather. In fact, you can use a piece of paper or cardboard or whatever you want. It just needs to be flat and smooth. Once we've got a good coat of jeweler's rouge on there, we're going to take the blade, we're going to lay it flat so that angle that's been ground into it is sitting flat against the leather, and then we're going to draw it across the leather. The big thing that you want to avoid is rolling the blade at the end of the stroke. That ends up rounding off your blade, and let's face it, it's pretty hard to cut with a dull knife. 1 or 2 times is not going to be a problem, but if you make a habit of that, you're going to end up with a butter knife. So just make sure you don't roll that blade at the end of the pull stroke. So next we're going to grab our tracing film, our pattern, and a pencil, and we're going to trace the image onto the tracing paper. After that, we're going to grab our leather and transfer the image to the leather. And we're simply going to do that by securing the pattern in place in relation to the leather. And then we're going to use our stylus to trace over the top of it. Now, if you're working on a practice piece, it's no big deal to tape the pattern directly to the leather. If you're working on a project, you don't want to do that. It can leave marks, it can leave sticky residue, all kinds of stuff. You definitely don't want to tape it to a project, but for a practice piece, it's no big deal. So as we work through this practice piece, I want you to focus on a couple of things. The first one would be consistent, smooth cuts. And the way we get a consistent, smooth cut is by letting the movement come from our arm, our elbow, and our shoulder. What we don't want to do is chop our way through the cuts. We want to make one long cut whenever possible, and that movement's all going to come from your arm. The other thing that you want to focus on is tapering your cuts. The way you taper a cut is to simply let off on the pressure gradually as you make the cut. That's going to let the blade lift out of the leather. So two questions you might have is, one, how deep do I cut? And two, when do I start tapering my cut? As far as how deep to cut, a general rule is you want to go about 1/3 of the way through the leather. Now, this is not going to work for every leather. If you're working on a 2-ounce leather, you can't cut 1/3 of the way through it. So you kind of have to gauge it based on the leather you're working with. But if you're working with a 4-ounce and up to maybe a 10-ounce, about 1/3 of the way through the leather is a good general rule. Now, how about when should I start tapering the cut? Well, a good general rule is that you want to start that taper about halfway through the cut. Now, this is not going to work for every cut, but in general, if you have a cut that's, 1 inch to 2 inches long, at least, you can start lifting off the pressure on that cut about halfway through, and by the time you get to the end, it should fade out into nothing. So I'm going to start with the longest cut in the design. And that would be this one right here along the back. Then I'm just going to work my way through the cuts, making sure that I take my time. Precision is more important than speed. Smooth cuts, taper the ends. So one of the trickier parts of this design are those curves that you see in a couple of different spots. Well, ideally, you would be cutting those in one long curve, and that's done by rotating the barrel of the blade and turning the leather at the same time. That can be a little bit of a patting your head, rubbing your stomach kind of thing if you're not used to running a swivel knife. So if you're not there yet, I want you to work towards that. But if you're not there yet, what you can do is you can make that cut in a series of cuts. So you make the cut until it gets to the point where you're uncomfortable, readjust, and do it again. The key is to overlap your cuts. You don't want your blade starting right where you left off at the last point. You want to move back, drop your blade down into that groove, and then start there. That's going to help those cuts blend together better. That eye is definitely going to be the most challenging part of this design. If you're not ready to tackle it yet, that's okay. You can just grab a cedar and put your eye in with a cedar. Just don't go too deep with it. So after that, we're going to go back and we're going to add in our decorative cuts. In this particular project, those decorative cuts are going to be very small, very light, very short cuts at the end of the longer cuts that we've already made. The keys here are, number one, we're using the cuts to create flow. To do that, most of the time you're not going to want them in a straight line. You're not going to want them one behind the other. You want them to overlap a little bit. And the other thing is, again, we want them to taper. To create that flow, we're going to make sure that all the different groupings of cuts all have a curve to them. As a general rule, you're going to want to go with odd numbers. 3 and 5 is better than 2 and 4. And the accents can be added anywhere you want them, but the goal should always be to add flow to the design. Keep asking yourself, how does this enhance the flow of the design? How does it flow into the other elements in the design? How would the feathers naturally flow? If you're a little unsure about where to put your decorative cuts, how to put them in, what the curve should look like, all that kind of thing, one of the things you can do is you can either grab a stylus or a pencil and very, very lightly scribe them in to kind of get an idea of what it would look like. Now, when I say lightly, I mean so lightly you almost can't see it, because if it's something you don't like, you don't want to have to try to erase it. You just want something to give you an idea of what it looks like. So a pencil or a stylus works great for that. So here's my final suggestion to you. Take this practice piece, do it every 2 to 3 weeks. It shouldn't take you more than 20 minutes once you get used to the flow. Then over time, go back and keep comparing it to that first one that you did so that you can see the progress you're making. You will be amazed at how quickly and how far you will come in a very short amount of time. That's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.